Welcome back to the DuPont Collaboration Series, and still with me in studio is Antoinette du Randt, Regional Director of DuPont Sustainable Solutions, Sheila Khama, who's Director of Extractive Resources Services at the African Center for Economic Transformation, Mandy, Rhambaros, who's Senior Manager of Climate Change and Sustainable Development at Eskom, and Victor Kgomoeswana, Executive Business Development at PPC. Let's get back into this conversation. Antoinette, we had Victor highlighting a monitoring system in place to monitor dust levels, for example, at PPC. I mean, establishing governance and accountability monitoring systems to evaluate just how well you're doing on sustainability imperatives has got to be key to this whole equation as well.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. So what we need clearly is transparency to all stakeholders, so that we understand, you know, if an organization is saying they're delivering X, that this is what they are delivering, and a methodology to measure that, both in a quantitative way but also in a qualitative way. So at DuPont we employ a methodology where you have metrics that's been developed with with international organizations, but we work not only on the typical metrics in terms of financial contribution and output, and that needs to be obviously disclosed, and we put it in our annual reports, but we also engage with all the stakeholders, whether it's qualitative through surveys, to understand whether we have changed perceptions in the communities. And that's part of how we measure this. In terms of governments who would ask specifically royalties and taxes, that's a very good system, and there's a lot more rigor around that, clearly, because countries need to benefit from what's been generated there. But we also then need to have methodologies and metrics on how that's been applied and how that's plowed back into those communities that deserve to actually benefit from that.
Do we have those metrics in place, to the level that they should be? Are companies getting this more right than wrong at this stage? Because it would speak to why blueprints aren't actually followed through and why we're seeing a lack of implementation or effective implementation.
Yeah. I mean, first there is the regulatory framework and the public institutions that are responsible. And then there is the private companies that are expected to comply. And then, of course, it's the population whose welfare, in any case, we are seeking to protect and foster. My experience working in 8 African countries today is that the capacity to regulate and enforce is probably one of the biggest and weakest links, biggest problems and weakest links in the governance space. Contrary to what people think, actually, private companies, precisely because many of them are listed in Europe and American stock exchanges and have onerous regulations imposed upon them, to which they ignore to their peril, are usually much more governance focused and much more compliant. And frankly, many of them on the African continent are well ahead of the governments that regulate them. Yeah. Another weak link is the population. Civil society organizations on the continent are very weak. And so when I think of governance, I think about the government's ability and capacity to design policies and implement effectively, and then the willingness by private companies to comply, and then the public voice, because your government is really only as responsible as it is held accountable. Yeah. And to be held accountable, you have to have an informed, able population that can engage constructively on the issue of sustainable development. In the absence of this tripartite arrangement, in my mind, governance remains very weak, and therefore our ability to promote sustainable development en masse, I think, is potentially compromised.
When it comes to that legislative framework, what's your interpretation of it? Is it rigorous enough?
Well, if you take the case of South Africa, if you look at some of our environmental regulations and labor acts, it's some of the best in the world in terms of how they are written, in terms of what they legislate and what they cover. But coming back to the point that Sheila was just making, the problem is implementation and monitoring how it gets done. So while there are things that are monitored and that are checked for implementation. There's a lot that falls by the wayside that's in regulations but companies don't fulfill. But coming back to the point of, I think when we talk about sustainable development and leading companies in this area, you have to go beyond compliance. You have to go beyond, okay, this is what legislation says, so this is what my targets are, and these are what my KPIs are that I need to meet. You need to go beyond that and measuring what your impact is to deliver the value that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So delivering value that we were talking about is not just about how much money am I making, but how are you creating value for the company and how you're creating value for society around you. One of the things we've done as Eskom, we produce our annual report, like most companies, an integrated report, which has all of the sustainability issues in there. But we've also asked ourselves our question, how have we impacted on this society? What value have we added? So we did what's called the Eskom Factor Report, which is basically a report that looks at going beyond the annual report and measuring our impact. And we got stakeholder feedback on how have we impacted you socially, how have we impacted you environmentally, and what has been our impact on the economy. And it's been absolutely a great experience doing that report, a great experience going out to stakeholders and hearing honest feedback, and also seeing the actual impact that we have had.
Yeah.
So I think going beyond what's legislated is extremely important in delivering.
You've
your
got
value.
some entities, though, Sheila, needing more of a hard-handed approach. I mean, you highlighted that, you know, JSE-listed companies are required to include environmental sustainability targets in their financial statements, and that forces them down that road. Specifically, we've had, you've mentioned the distinction as well between the private space and the public space, and I came across commentary that suggested, like some European countries, the Chinese government at this stage of the game is looking at sustainability reporting mandatory for state-owned companies as well, a model that South Africa may need to consider employing to advance efficiencies, for example, in public services. Just how viable an avenue is that for us to start exploring?
Yeah. Well, before I answer, if I may just say, add something to what was said. One of the important things about private companies and their ability to deliver value is exactly that very often, one, their global outreach far extends any sovereign state. Two, their asset base is much bigger. And very often they are much more resourced than the governments that regulate them. That suggests that the partnership between the state and investors, especially the large investors, is vital for defining this sustainability, because they bring a lot more knowledge and information. And so the proactive nature of private enterprise in delivering that value in that relationship, I think, is one of the key components of effective sustainability. But to your point of public companies being held accountable, in my mind, the issue is not the corporate structure of any entity. That is irrelevant. That listed companies happen to have onerous listed requirements is fortunate for us. But that isn't why we hold them to account. We hold them to account because, in effect, they are using natural resources that are really entrusted in the state. And out of that, logic says we get a return. That return, to me, is sustainable development. Because if that return is short-term, then actually the next generation has not gotten a return. And China is particularly, for me, interesting because China, of course, is schizophrenic. We speak of China like it's a single entity, but China is a sovereign state. China is a country with huge corporations that the state owned. And then, of course, China is a country like any with private investors. And so I think when we talk about China, it's important to know that China has many facets. But actually, from a sustainable development perspective, in my mind, that is not relevant. What is important is that if we engage Chinese companies on the African continent, they must be held to account on sustainable development issues to the same level that we have held our own local enterprises, foreign multinationals, privately owned or publicly listed.
Okay, so that differentiation being made, let's drill down into things on a sector basis here. I mean, any trends that have emerged on that front? Is this shift in thinking more relevant for particular industries than others, or is it across the board thinking when it comes to entities operating in the private space?
It will be across the board understanding if we're talking sustainability broadly, but if you're talking about the impact on environment, some sectors are much more.
But in terms of who's doing what?
Well, in our sector, manufacturing, mining and manufacturing, everybody's obliged to do, as
and
I
that's
say.
because they're in the spotlight.
Yeah,
They're
exactly.
perceived to be the dirty
I mean,
industries.
exactly. In addition to the ISO 1400 environmental standards, we have the what we call the Aggregates and Sands Producers Association of South Africa. Those are entitled to independent inspection of what we do. Then we have the Green Scorpions, which comes on the side of the government. We have community structures where we give reporting, as I say, because we print the continuous monitoring of whatever particulate dust that we're emitting to make sure it's within acceptable level. And anybody should be able to look at our graph, not just what is the monthly average. It should be on a continuous basis. Was there a date where you went over, and how many incidents of you going over the limit were there, and what did you do about it? And it goes to us having to be more voluntary and proactive in reporting rather than be responding to legislative or regulatory requirements. But also something interesting that our new CEO just did coming into the community. He said, look, we're a cement company. Our product has gone into roads, into sports venues, into parliament, union buildings and all that. But what about the people we employ, which is what Mandy was talking about with regard to the communities in which you operate? Have you had an impact on them? And he said, I just don't want to hear in a year or two that any PPC employee is struggling to build a house, because you can't produce a product that goes into building houses, roads, and you still have an employee who retires without a house, which is another way of just saying that one of the most prized possessions of anybody is a house to call their own. Now, if we are producing this cement that goes into the construction industry, we can never afford to have an employee who says, I've retired from PPC and I don't have a house. Now, that sounds very simple, and often it's not going to be expensive for us to meet that requirement if you just consider the size of the business. But it takes, but what it takes a leader, yet again, who is courageous, and he made this decision within the first 3 months of his arrival, which means there's a courage for him to say, while I'm still popular, I'm going to challenge the stereotypes, I'm going to challenge what this company has been doing for 120 years.
Yeah, but Sheila, your comment then highlighting the fact that not enough companies are doing it, and that's what makes possibly working for PPC so appealing.
Yeah, but I mean, of course, that's exactly the point, that you have internal and external constituents. Yeah. What one does from a sustainable development perspective for one's employees is not necessarily the same for what one does for the community, which is what you were talking about, Mandy, at ESCOM. But I wanted to come back to your question of, is this sustainability issue more a burning platform for some industries than others, and why? The short answer is yes. And the reason is simple. In the extractives, as the word describes, you really are extracting, but you are not just extracting. Very often it's a finite entity. That suggests, therefore, that there are trade-offs, in that if you extract that, you need to consider that in perpetuity you have removed something that the soil, the community can never recover. That's a tall order to then try and replicate that value in perpetuity and make sure that somehow morally you acquire that license. Because to me, the notion of moral license assumes that there is a value, and that in that pyramid of values, you assume moral high ground. And I think the extractives are challenged because physically we can see them. For one, these are assets that are owned by the state or entrusted in the state for the population, so we feel emotionally attached to them. But also visually, they are very impactful. You see a great big mine, but you don't see as a factory. They are not that intrusive. But the truth of the matter is, we also know from a carbon footprint perspective, whether it is the energy they consume, the energy they burn, and then the ripple effect of the products that they then put in the environment. So it is a big deal, and so it should be. My point is simply that it shouldn't be a big deal at the expense of other industries. And that while we focus on the extractives, we may do so at the expense of understanding many other challenges in other industries that because we are not paying attention to them, that may eventually be doing more harm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, to what extent does it depend on the customer you interface with? I mean, we've spoken about stakeholders, shareholders, communities as well, but how cognizant is the consumer market, for example? How is it influencing who they do business with, for example, when it comes to the retail sector of the economy?
Well, think about the recent, what did you say, meat scandal in South Africa, where people found out, oops, we thought we've been eating beef while we're eating a whole lot of other things. I mean, the dent of that on the brand of the business is almost irreparable damage, because people know that they've been duped for so long. So you might be tempted to think, because your customers, and Sheila makes the point, sometimes the customer, sometimes the government will not be as sophisticated as your business, but all you need is one case of even an allegation that you have not been compliant with quality standards, then you are seen as the socially responsible, unethical business. So consumers eventually will make a choice, especially if your competitors are able to keep up. And that's why it has to be industry collaboration, that we agree that we will hold one another responsible for upholding certain standards, at least minimum standards, and then we can compete on other things.
Has it been able to be done where we're able to put a value to this? Just how much brand value being sustainable and incorporating that kind of initiative has on a brand?
I think if you recognize that sustainability and the effect on reputation and brand can actually deliver a competitive advantage, that can really be quantified, because ultimately, whether it's the end consumer or anybody within the value chain, we operate as an organization, we have a vantage point from an ingredient point of view, because we're in other people's value chains, if you will. But if you can go from a place, Mandy said this earlier as well, of where you commit, where you go from compliance to commitment to a sustainable legacy, and you articulate that and you communicate that transparently, clearly people will make a choice.
Yeah.
People want to be associated with this, but ultimately, collectively, we then preserve the environment.
And you've got to also look at to what extent this equation works the other way around. I mean, ethical products and services that will change consumers' behaviors and then help them in turn live a more sustainable life.
Absolutely. And if you look at energy efficiency, is a very, very clear example of that, where we've been promoting energy efficiency. Granted, it's come from the supply-demand deficit that we have in the country, but even if you have a lot of supply of energy, we still need to be an energy efficient society. And I think when we look at the programs for promoting energy efficiency in other companies, amongst consumers, it does lead people to question, well, why do I leave the lights on in a room when I'm not there? And that ultimately is a simple question, but ultimately talks about leading a sustainable lifestyle. But also want to come back to your question about the sectors and looking at your consumers upstream and downstream. I think when we talk about sustainability strategies in your company and you talk about the sustainability of your company, you have to look at your supply chain. You have to look upstream and downstream and say, okay, I can't be in this little island and be this wonderfully sustainable company if I'm sourcing my coal from a company that's not sustainable, or I'm providing electricity to a customer that's not sustainable. So I think where the evolution of the sustainability discussion has come to is how far do you go? And how far up and downstream do you go? So that when you talk about yourself as a sustainable company, in your mind you're also comfortable with the fact that you are dealing with people that also have this mindset. And it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's a journey as well, that once you have the mindset and the beliefs within your company, that you can also talk to your upstream and downstream people about it.
If I may,
of course.
The question of how can you value the collateral around a brand because the company promotes sustainable best practice. The short answer is very difficult. Yeah, you can put it on a balance sheet, but value, there's inherent value and then there's realizable value. You'll never know just how much you're going to sell the house until the check comes. You know, the estate agent can value. So brands are very much like that, that they can be valued on a balance sheet, but whether you can actually sell them when the day comes is another matter, which is why we mustn't see sustainable development as a brand driver in that respect. Not in the sense that you can immediately cash in on it, but more in the approach that we spoke of earlier, which is that you can sustain value and that you are not in your actions today inherently creating future risk. That to me is a much better nature form of value from a sustainable development perspective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think I just wanted to add as well, if you have been on this journey, some of us started earlier than others perhaps, then enter into knowledge partnerships where you understand your place in the value chain, you understand who's before you, who comes after you, and collaborate to actually find those solutions and impart the knowledge to accelerate this, to help other people improve their sustainability performance. We do that at DuPont, and I encourage other companies to do that as well, because we have, collectively, we have a lot of knowledge that can accelerate this process and deliver sustainable value.
Is collaboration happening enough in your books, Victor? I mean, we speak about the role of social partners, government and civil society, but then also taking the knowledge, lessons learned and letting it filter through.
And collaboration is good up to a certain level, because then beyond a certain point it becomes collusion, which is also not sustainable, a sustainable business practice. That you end up collaborating so much that you are seen to be trying to exploit the consumer or deprive your stakeholders of the value they could derive. So there is collaboration in that, as I say. When you buy a PPC, bag of PPC cement and you buy another brand, you should be able to know for sure if this one says it's 35.2, that one says it's 42.5. You are buying more or less the same product. The strength is guaranteed, which means if one is not able to hold their peers accountable, the industry loses credibility. If the industry loses credibility, I think Sheila said off air that then you all lose, and it doesn't matter who caused the problem, because you all lose. So collaboration is important in that you have a collective responsibility to create healthy competition and give the consumer the option.
And that's exactly it, because there's a flip side to this as well. I mean, it's a very fine line that you've got to walk, because to what extent do you collaborate so that it doesn't erode the competitive advantage that you're trying to garner?
It's like in a sporting environment. Think about it in a sporting environment. We agree. We all want to win. Two teams agree. Each one wants to win as badly as the other, but we agree. Once we have agreed on the rules, we play by them, and we guarantee that we will respect the outcome before we know what the outcome is.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I think it's very important, the point that Antoinette is making about collaboration, because okay, the competition thing doesn't really affect me because we're a monopoly. But I mean, you can understand where that comes from as well. But I think what's important is that when it comes to sustainable development, when we talk about creating value for the communities we work in and communities we live in, learning from across sectors is very important. So not just sticking to your sector, but looking at a community and saying, well, we need financial upliftment in the community. We can't do it ourselves. We're providing the electricity. How do we collaborate with the financial sector, for example, that can help with our strategy? So I think collaboration also not just purely with your peers within a sector, but across sectors is very important to learn from best practice from another sector. When we were talking about the extractive industries and the energy industries earlier, yes, like Sheila was saying, they're very high impact, so very much in everybody's minds about who's doing the damage in terms of sustainability. But I think if you look at the hotel industry, if you look at the the finance industry, they also have an impact. And you think about, okay, how do you guys do sustainable development? What do you do in terms of sustainability, and how can we work with each other across sectors to learn? So collaboration, even in that respect, I think is extremely important.
And that's exactly what I meant in terms of defining what that sustainable solution would look like.
Yes.
And then leveraging the collective expertise to get there. But very practically and with really defined ownership of who is going to make this happen on the ground.
Absolutely. Well, looking at the broader picture, I mean, from a fiscal position, do you think more incentives should be put on the table in terms of incentives, so tax breaks, enticing business to a larger extent down this route?
No, I don't think so. I don't think I don't think industry should be enticed. Yeah, I think industry with governments should partner to recognize there exists a problem, which requires collective action. Yes, to entice suggest somehow that they are not integral to the solution, that actually their presence is a nice to have.
Yeah.
Their presence is not
And
a nice
as you
to
said,
have.
this is a value proposition in
Yeah,
itself.
yes,
Exactly.
not only is it a value proposition, but actually it is integral to that moral license. They are part of industry that is impacting upon our lives now, today, and in the future. There is a trade-off there. The trade-off for me is that minimally we should do no harm. But if we should do harm, we must understand the nature of it. We must contain it. We must invest in R&D to contain future harm. I don't see how you should be given tax break for doing that which is responsible. Yeah, I don't think that it should be.
I agree, because that's a short-term solution. That's not a long-term solution, and that doesn't speak to shared ownership of the problem and shared ownership of the solution ultimately as well. If we're going to invest in R&D to find these innovative solutions, let's have a conversation around that rather. Let's define what does it look like if you are going to take from the ground, what do you need to put back to actually optimize and minimize the impact and maximize social impact as well. You know, as a company, that you then commit to that publicly and that you drive your investment towards innovation that will help solve the problem.
Although I do think there is a place for a slightly different view. I agree with what you're saying, but I do think there's a place for incentives. For example, if we want people to switch to compact fluorescent lights, or we want them to switch to solar water heaters, which are more expensive currently than your normal geysers or your normal lights, I think it's important to provide society with that subsidy or that incentive to enable them to go and purchase something that's more expensive, that in the long run has a benefit of energy efficiency, of saving us money as a country. So there is a place for incentives, but responsibly done and in the right context.
So now we've got to get
But
your
why
vote.
are they more expensive? No, but,
Yes.
but why are they more expensive? I would like to ask that question.
Okay.
Why would anybody sell something that's seen to be having a positive
Well, let's
impact
give
on life?
Mandy right of response there.
Yes, I think currently they're more expensive because of pure economics, supply demand. We have more normal geysers than we do efficient ones. And I think the more we grow those industries in this country, the more you employ more of a technology, the cheaper it becomes. So hopefully in the long run, as South Africa gets more and more energy efficient and we get more and more of these technologies in, they will become cheaper. But I think to kickstart the industry, an incentive is required.
How are you voting?
I think part of the responsibility is in pricing what we are offering. If we are going to overprice something, when we know it could deliver an impact, a positive impact on the communities and environment that we are offering, perhaps the private sector has a responsibility to re-look at what they're doing. And I'm saying that as somebody from the private sector. We should start thinking much more broadly, again, than just maximizing profit for now. And I'm sure none is innocent here. We all are guilty at one point or another of taking advantage of a shortage of lower demand and the fact that we are maybe first in the market. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being rewarded for innovation. But I believe that if we want to think sustainably, even in our pricing, we should be much more. So I wouldn't be a one for incentives unless, of course, it's a matter of the majority of the population not being able to afford that, which is seen as the case. At the moment, then in that case, there's room for looking at it.
Antoinette, just as a closing comment, I mean, are you encouraged by what's happening so far, the kind of progress we're making on this front?
I think there has been tremendous progress. I think in terms of the awareness of people really looking at this issue with a commitment to make a difference. Can we do much better? Most definitely. I think, again, if we work together and we harness the collective knowledge and we put practical, tripartite, agreed solutions on the table, we have a winning solution.
Let's leave it there. Thank you all for having joined me today, and our 60 minutes are up. With that, we've come to the end of this first edition of the DuPont Collaboration Series. Thanks to my guests today, Antoinette du Randt, Sheila Khama, Mandy, Rhambaros and Victor Kgomoeswana as well. Until next time, it's goodbye from me, Alicia Seckham, and thank you so much for joining us.